Boston and Maine's balance sheet, almost from its beginning as a corporate entity, was choked by a tangled web of branch lines, dozens of them. In its haste to become the dominant railroad system of New England, the founders wove together literally hundreds of short lines, conceived in the frenzy of railroad building in the 1850s and 60s by local entrepreneurs, eager town councils, and civic boosters of every stripe. What they couldn't buy, they leased. The Boston and Lowell Railroad, the first real main line, built in 1830 to replace the canal, was successful beyond the wildest dreams of its founders. It inspired a burst of more than 700 railroad charges between that time and the mid-1870s. Consider, for example, the Skowhegan and Norridgewock, the Manchester, Dorset, and Granville, or the Reedfield, Winthrop, and Kabasi-Condi. When faced with the reality of funding, few, of course, ever went beyond the planning stage. But every rail laid became a potential threat to the Boston and Maine's dream of monopoly. Why should a line, headed straight as a die for some burgeoning industrial area, suddenly have a 90-degree turn on almost level ground and pursue some less desirable destination? It's probable that when the builders reached the turning point, they were bought out by the Boston and Maine, which already served their planned destination. 3712 is being run in after overhaul at Billerica. Note the scrap line in the distance. From 1935 to 1939, Baldwin made 13 slick-looking mountains with centipede tenders, the last steam delivered to the Boston and Maine. These, plus another 5 delivered in 41, managed both freight and high-speed passenger trains during the war. Gas cars, sometimes called doodlebugs, came before streamliners. This one handled the morning Boston-Bangor train known as the Kennebec, with parlor cars and coaches. The Rexall Special, described in Part 2 of B&M Steam, is just behind. The Kennebec continued to run, but this streamlined train replaced the B&M's fastest train to Portland and became the Flying Yankee. In a sense, the rails of that time served much as the paved highways that came along with the automobile some 50 years later. They ran almost everywhere. You could board a train in Worcester, Mass. For Portland, Maine via Manchester, New Hampshire, and never come within 50 miles of the Boston metropolitan complex. As the automobile clattered onto the scene and the Great Depression descended with a vengeance on New England's textile-based economy, trains on many of the Boston, Maine branches ran on an as-needed basis. For a short distance, the Stoneham branch was the steepest grade on the Boston and Maine system. In this picture, we show those branch lines which were still in active service into the 30s, most of them commuter lines around Boston. Commuter trains shot like streamers of a skyrocket in almost a 180-degree fan from Boston. Here are some of them. Some branches were long ones. It's 70 miles from Concord, New Hampshire to the lumber mills at Lincoln on the Boston, Maine White Mountain branch, and hardly a single siding in between. During good times, half of this branch had carried the premier trains of the Canadian Pacific between Montreal and Boston. The Red Wing and the Alouette, each with its brass-railed observation car. When the connection from Plymouth to Woodsville was abandoned and the cracked trains shifted to White River Junction, the White Mountain branch saw at most only 2 or 3 freights a week. The ties were left to sink into the soil, and the weeds grew with delight. Such was the fate of literally hundreds of miles of Boston, Maine branch line. Trains passed beneath the hill in the center of Salem. Crossing the Salem and Lowell Railroad at West Peabody. The Essex branch was famous for its excursions. The railroad maintained a picnic park called Centennial Grove. Here comes a special run for the New England Coal Company. This dicey maneuver, known in the old days as a flying switch, is not something a main line railroad practices very often today, and never with passenger cars. After getting the cars up to a good speed, the engine disconnects and races through the switch to the right. The brakeman throws the switch quickly, and the cars go left. The engineer is attaching a bunch of goldenrod flowers to his coupler to celebrate the special. You're in Bedford, Mass. The branch to the left goes to Concord. The several engines wait their turns to power the morning commuter trains from Lexington to Boston. thin line on our map, extending straight west beneath the Fitchburg Division, represents the central Massachusetts branch of the Boston Maine. In this picture, it joins the Fitchburg Division at Clematis Brook. Originally, the Central Mass proceeded on its own tracks parallel to the Boston Maine right-of-way to Cambridge, where it swung north and joined the right-of-way of the New Hampshire Division to Boston. The train passes over the Wachusett Reservoir on the Central Mass and enters the second longest tunnel on the Boston Maine, after the Hoosick. The Central Mass was an attempt to add a third east-west line across Massachusetts, halfway between the Boston Maine Fitchburg Division to the north and the Boston and Albany to the south. It never got beyond Northampton in the Connecticut Valley. By the time this picture was made, the branch that remained was only 36 miles long, terminating here at Clinton.